There are some men whose wealth does not merely impress, it offends the gods. In the village of Ajogun, nestled between the swollen belly of the river Omi and the ancient red hills that had watched over 10 generations of births and burials, there lived a man named Chukwemeka Obi. Most people simply called him Emeka, though in his later years, when the weight of his fortune bent even the air around him, they called him chief. Not because anyone had given him a chieftaincy, but because wealth, in certain quantities, begins to crown a man without ceremony. Emeka was not born rich. That part is important. The story of a man born into riches is a story with no real tension, no real lesson. But the story of a man who builds his fortune from the cracked earth of nothing, that is a story the gods watch closely. And the gods of Ajogun had been watching Emeka for a very long time. His mother, Adise, had raised him alone in a 2-room mud house at the edge of the village, the kind of house where the roof argued with the rain every wet season and always lost. His father had died of a fever when Emeka was 4, leaving behind nothing but a rusted machete, a torn fishing net, and a reputation for kindness that fed nobody. Adise took in washing, plaited hair, and sold roasted groundnuts by the roadside. She was a woman made entirely of endurance, and she poured every drop of that endurance into her son. Emeka grew up watching his mother's hands bleed and heal and bleed again. He watched her smile at customers who spoke to her as though she were furniture. He watched her pray every evening at the small shrine near the doorway, not to any Christian god or Islamic Allah, but to the old spirits, the ones who had been in Ajogun long before any foreign religion arrived. She would whisper to them, leaving small offerings of kola nut and palm wine on the clay altar. "Protect my son," she would say. "Make him greater than his father's grave." The spirits listened. But spirits, as the elders always say, answer prayers in ways that are rarely comfortable. By the time Emeka was 22, he had left Ajogun for the city of Lagos. He had one change of clothes, a small envelope of money his mother had saved for 3 years, and the kind of hunger in his eyes that city people recognize immediately. Some are threatened by it, some are drawn to it. Emeka was lucky enough to meet people in the second category. He started as an errand boy for a trading company owned by a Lebanese merchant named Khalil. He swept floors, carried goods, counted inventory, and listened. Emeka was a spectacular listener. He absorbed everything around him like dry earth absorbs rain, completely, instantly, without waste. Within a year, he understood the trading business better than men who had worked there for a decade. Within 3 years, Khalil trusted him to negotiate deals. Within 5, Emeka had saved enough to start his own small enterprise. He traded in building materials first: cement, iron rods, roofing sheets. Nigeria was always building something, always reaching upward, always constructing. It was a hungry country, and Emeka fed it. He was sharp without being dishonest, aggressive without being reckless, and, in those early years, generous in the way that people who remember poverty tend to be generous. He remembered what it felt like to have nothing, and so he gave back when he had something. He returned to Ajogun when he was 35 with a brand new Mercedes-Benz, enough money to build his mother a proper house with a zinc roof and tiled floors, and a reputation that had traveled ahead of him like drumbeats. The village received him the way villages always receive men who have conquered the city, with a mixture of genuine celebration and barely concealed envy. Children ran beside his car. Women leaned out of doorways to watch. Old men who had barely acknowledged his mother's existence suddenly found warm smiles for her son. Emeka noticed all of it. He was a man who noticed everything. He built his mother's house first. Then he built himself a compound. Not a house, a compound, with thick concrete walls painted the color of cream, a gate made of wrought iron with his initials welded into the design, a generator that hummed through the night when the power company forgot that Ajogun existed, and a sitting room furnished with leather sofas imported from Italy. He installed a borehole for the village. He paid the school fees of 16 children whose parents could not afford them. He donated to the church and quietly, when no one was watching, also left palm wine at the old river shrine, because Adiz had raised him to respect all doorways to the sacred. For a few years, Emeka was the kind of rich man that villages make songs about. The kind that made people believe wealth and goodness could live in the same body. But money, like water, changes the shape of whatever vessel holds it. And as Emeka's fortune grew, as the contracts multiplied, as the properties accumulated, as the accounts in 3 different banks swelled beyond what one man could reasonably spend in 3 lifetimes, something in him began to shift. Slowly at first, the way a tree leans before it falls, so gradually you don't notice until the shadow is pointing the wrong direction. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. Stories from the heart of Africa, told the way our grandmothers used to tell them, around the fire, without rushing, without skipping the parts that matter. The first sign of the change was the way he began to speak to his workers. There were 12 men and 4 women on his compound staff, cooks, gardeners, drivers, security men, a personal assistant named Tebena, who had a university degree and still called Emeka Sir, with the same fear a child reserves for thunder. In the early days, Emeka had known all their names, asked after their children, settled their disputes fairly. But somewhere around his 42nd year, he stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as functions. The gardener was a function. The cook was a function. Tebena was a function. They existed to serve the machinery of his life, and machinery does not require courtesy. The second sign was the land. The river Omi curved around the eastern edge of Ajogun like a mother's arm around a sleeping child. Its banks were rich, dark soil, perfect for farming, and for generations the villagers had planted there, small plots that fed families through dry seasons, gardens that supplemented whatever the market could provide. There was an unspoken agreement, older than any document, that the riverbank belonged to everyone and to no one. It was the kind of agreement that exists only in communities where people still understand that some things are held in common not because of law, but because of love. Emeka wanted that land. He had done the calculations. The river road was going to be expanded by the state government. He had a contact in the ministry who had told him this privately, over pepper soup and beer in a hotel in Enugu. When the road expanded, the land along the river would quadruple in value overnight. Emeka wanted to own as much of it as possible before the announcement became public. So he began buying. Quietly at first, approaching individual families with offers that were generous enough to seem fair, but low enough to be, in hindsight, robbery. Some families sold. They were poor, and cash in hand speaks a language that future value cannot compete with. But others refused. Old Nwosu, who had farmed the same strip of riverbank for 40 years, told Emeka's representative that the land was not his to sell. It had been given to his family by the river spirit itself, and only the river could take it back. 3 other families said similar things, in different words, all pointing to the same truth. This land was not simply earth and water. It was memory. It was covenant. Emeka was not moved by memory or covenant. He went to the local government office, and through a combination of money and influence and paperwork that materialized in ways no one could quite explain, he obtained documentation claiming ownership of the disputed riverbank land. The documents were, by every technical measure, legal. They were also, by every human measure, wrong. Old Nwosu wept when the notices came. Not the quiet weeping of embarrassment, but the loud, full-throated grief of a man who has lost something irreplaceable. He sat in front of his farmland, his father's land, his grandfather's land, and wept like a child, and the sound of it traveled through the village the way bad news always travels. Faster than you want, reaching everyone before you have time to prepare them. The village did not march on Emeka's compound. They were poor, and he was powerful, and they had watched enough of life to know that those 2 facts rarely resolve in favor of the poor. But they stopped calling him chief. Quietly, without announcement, the title dissolved. And they began to talk about him the way people talk about someone who has already died, with a sadness that is also a goodbye. Emeka noticed none of this. Or perhaps he noticed and did not care. He was busy. The road expansion was confirmed 6 months after he completed his land acquisitions. The value of the riverbank property surged exactly as his contact had predicted. On paper, Emeka was now worth more than he had ever been. He celebrated with a party at his compound. A party so elaborate that people talked about it for years afterward, though not always with admiration. There were 2 live bands, a catered buffet, imported drinks, a generator powerful enough to light 3 streets, and guests who arrived in cars that cost more than the average Ajogun family earned in a decade. Adiz did not attend the party. She was still alive then, 71 years old, living in the beautiful house her son had built her, tended by a young woman Emeka paid to look after her. But she had stopped speaking to Emeka about anything that mattered. She would greet him warmly when he visited, accept the money he pressed into her palm, eat the food he brought, and then, when he tried to talk to her about his business, about the land, about the future, she would look at him with eyes that were quiet in the way of someone who has already mourned something and finished mourning it. One evening, Emeka came to visit and found her at the small shrine near her doorway. The same one she had kept in every house she had ever lived in, carried with her like a heartbeat. She was placing a small bowl of water at the base of the clay figure, the figure that represented the River Omi's spirit, a tradition older than the village itself. "Mama," Emeka said, standing in the doorway. "You still do that?" She did not turn around. "I do it more now," she said. "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he thought she would not answer. Then she said, in the slow, deliberate voice of someone choosing words the way you choose steps across unstable ground. "The river remembers every name it has been given, and it remembers every wrong done in its shadow." She turned and looked at him then. "Go home, Emeka. Eat well. Sleep well while you can." He left unsettled in a way he could not explain and spent the drive home trying to dismiss the feeling. He almost succeeded. It started with the dreams. Emeka had always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of man who descended into unconsciousness like a stone into water, leaving no ripples, surfacing only when the alarm demanded it. But in the months following the land acquisition, something began to happen in the hours between midnight and dawn. He would wake at the same time every night, not gradually, not with the slow swimming up of ordinary waking, but suddenly completely, as if someone had shouted his name directly into his ear. He would sit up in his enormous bed, in his enormous room, in the silence of his generator-powered compound, and listen. There was never anything to hear. The night would be perfectly still. But the feeling that something had called him, that something knew his name, specifically his name, not Chief, not Emeka the businessman, but the name his mother had whispered at the river shrine the night he was born, that feeling would stay with him for hours. He told himself it was stress. He was a man with many obligations, many enemies, many competitors. Stress was natural. He drank a small measure of brandy before bed and slept better for a week. Then the dreams started. In the dreams, he was always standing at the river. Not the river as it was now, tamed by his new retaining wall and his surveyor's pegs and his government documents, but the river as it had been in his childhood, wide and unhurried, brown and gleaming, with hyacinth floating on its surface and egrets standing in the shallows like white thoughts. In the dream, he would stand at the edge and look into the water, and the water would look back. Not literally. There was no face, no figure. But he would feel it, the looking, the recognition, the way you feel when something ancient and knowing turns its attention to you. And then the water would begin to speak. Not with words, exactly. More like the idea of words, felt rather than heard, pressing into his chest from the inside. "I know your name, Chukwuemeka. I know what you have taken. I know what you have forgotten." He would wake gasping, heart slamming, drenched in sweat that smelled strange even to him. Mineral, cold, like river water. He went to a doctor in the city. The doctor ran tests, found nothing alarming, suggested sleep hygiene improvements and mild sedatives. Emeka took the sedatives. He still woke at midnight, bolt upright, listening for a voice he could not hear with his ears. Tabena, his personal assistant, noticed the change but said nothing. He was not paid to notice. But he watched, and he remembered, and later he would be the one to describe this period to those who asked. The period when the chief began to seem like a man standing on ground that was slowly becoming water. The second strange thing was the fish. Emeka had stocked a small private pond on his compound, a vanity project, Really, a man-made water feature designed by a landscape architect from Abuja. He kept decorative fish in it, large orange and white koi imported at considerable expense. One morning, his groundskeeper came to him with a face arranged in the careful blankness of someone delivering news he does not want to be blamed for. All the fish were dead. Every single one, floating on the surface of the green water, silver-bellied and still. What happened? Emeka demanded. Before we continue, if this story is moving you, if you feel the truth in it the way you feel a drumbeat in your chest before you hear it with your ears, please subscribe to this channel right now and click the bell icon. New stories from the African tradition, told with all their depth and power, are uploaded every week. Do not let the algorithm hide them from you. Subscribe, click the bell, and let the stories find you. Adiz died on a Tuesday in the early dry season, peacefully, in her sleep, the way good people are supposed to die when the universe still has some kindness in it. She was 73. She was buried with the small clay figure from her shrine, as she had instructed, and her funeral was attended by the entire village because whatever their feelings about her son, Adiz had been beloved. She had been the kind of woman who made people feel less alone simply by existing. Emeka grieved. Whatever else had changed in him, whatever the money had done to his character, the grief for his mother was real and total. He sat beside her grave for an hour after everyone else had gone and talked to her the way you can only talk to the dead, without pretense, without performance, without the armor that men like him wear in the presence of the living. He told her he was sorry for the things he had not said. He told her he remembered the groundnuts, the bleeding hands, the prayers at the shrine. He told her he had not forgotten. But something happened at the funeral that unsettled him more than the grief. Old Nwosu, the man whose farmland Emeka had taken, who had wept publicly when the notices came, attended the burial. He came quietly, stood at the back of the gathering, paid his respects to Adiz's memory with the sincerity of a man who had genuinely loved her. As the burial ended and people began to disperse, Nwosu walked slowly toward Emeka. He was ancient Nwosu. Nobody knew exactly how old, the kind of old that is no longer measured in years but in seasons. His face was all valleys and elevations, like the land itself had decided to make a portrait of itself in human skin. He stood before Emeka and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at him. And in that looking, Emeka felt, for the first time in years, truly seen. Not his wealth, not his reputation, not the power that surrounded him like a force field. Just him, Chukwuemeka, the boy who used to run barefoot along the river road. Your mother was a righteous woman, Nwosu said finally. She was, Emeka agreed. She prayed for you every day at the river shrine. She prayed that you would be great. But she also prayed that you would be good. He paused. She knew that those two things are harder to keep together than people believe. Emeka said nothing. There was nothing to say. The river has your name, Nwosu said, as if this were a simple fact, a weather observation. I am not telling you this as a threat. I am an old man. I have no power to threaten. I am telling you this because your mother loved you, and I loved your mother, and it is the only gift I can give her now that she is gone, to say the true thing to her son, even if her son does not want to hear it. He turned and walked away with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who has learned that the ground, like everything else, must be treated with respect. That night, Emeka did not sleep at all. He sat in his leather chair in his lit sitting room and thought about Nwosu's words. He was not, he told himself, a superstitious man. He was a man of business, of contracts, of measurable reality. The dreams were stress. The fish were a water quality issue that the technicians had missed. The borehole was a geological anomaly. There was an explanation for everything, and the explanation did not involve rivers having opinions about human behavior. But there was another voice in him, smaller, older, the voice that had grown up watching his mother at the shrine, that had absorbed her reverence for the unseen world, not as religion but as common sense. And that voice was saying something else entirely. The trouble was that Emeka had spent 20 years building walls against that voice. And the walls were very thick. 3 months after Adiz's burial, Emeka's largest construction contract was cancelled. The government ministry that had awarded it, through a connection he had cultivated for years, suddenly reversed the decision after an audit raised questions about the procurement process. Emeka's lawyers went to work immediately, and the lawyers were good, and he was not personally implicated in anything criminal. But the contract was gone, and with it, a sum of money that would have been the crown jewel of his portfolio. He absorbed the blow the way rich men do, with fury directed at subordinates and a calculation of how to recover. He was not ruined. He was still extraordinarily wealthy. But it was the first time in his professional life that he had lost something significant, and the experience had an unfamiliar taste, bitter and cold, like water from a dark place. Then his business partner of 12 years, a man named Afani who had grown alongside him from the early trading days, who had been the best man at Emeka's wedding, who knew where every secret was buried, came to him one afternoon and told him he was withdrawing from their joint ventures. He had been offered a position running a major construction firm in South Africa. It was a good opportunity. He was going to take it. He said all of this with the measured, reasonable tone of a man who has rehearsed the conversation many times. And Emeka, who had read people his entire life, could hear clearly what was not being said. That Afani was leaving not because of the South Africa opportunity, but because something had changed in Emeka, something that made continued proximity feel dangerous in a way that Afani could not fully articulate, but could not ignore. They shook hands and parted with the formal courtesy of men who have already said a deeper, wordless goodbye. That same week, a crack appeared in the wall of Emeka's compound. Not a small crack, not the hairline variety that appears in any concrete structure after a few years. A wide, jagged crack that ran from the top of the eastern wall to the base, as if something had pushed from the outside or the inside in a straight, purposeful line. The mason who came to inspect it shook his head and could not explain it. The wall was sound. The foundation was sound. There was no reason for this crack. But the crack was there, and when Emeka pressed his palm against it, it was cold. In the middle of the dry season, with the sun at its most aggressive, the concrete on either side of that crack was cold as river water. He stood there with his hand against the cold stone for a long time. Then he went inside and called for Tebena. "Find me someone," he said. "A traditional priest. Someone who knows the old ways. Someone serious." Tebena was careful not to show any reaction. "Yes, sir," he said. "I know a man." The man Tebena knew was named Ezenwanyi, which means king of women, and is a title given to certain priests of the old religion who are believed to carry the authority of both male and female spiritual energy. He was a small, compact man, perhaps 60 years old, with a shaved head and eyes the color of deep water. He arrived at Emeka's compound on a Thursday morning without ceremony, carrying a cloth bag and wearing a white wrapper. He walked through the gate, looked at the cracked wall without approaching it, looked at the dry borehole, looked at the empty pond, and then looked at Emeka. "You know why I am here," he said. It was not a question. "I am having some unexplained problems," Emeka said carefully. "You have taken what belongs to the river," Ezenwanyi said, "and the river has noticed." Emeka felt the familiar resistance rise in him, the reflex of the educated, the prosperous, the modern, but something else rose too, something older and more honest, and it sat on the resistance and was heavier. "What does it want?" he asked. "The river does not want. The river is not a person. It is a principle." Ezenwanyi looked at him with those deep water eyes. "The principle is this. What is taken without right spirit must be returned, or the one who took it will spend the rest of his life in a kind of dryness that has nothing to do with water." "Return the land?" "That is the beginning." "Yes." They sat together for 3 hours. Ezenwanyi spoke of the old laws, not religious law, not civil law, but the law of relationship between human beings and the living world around them. He spoke of the river Omi not as a spirit with demands, but as a living system of consequence, as dependable as gravity. What you put in comes back. What you take without permission is always, eventually, reclaimed. These were not punishments. They were simply the shape of reality. Emeka listened with an attention he had not given to anything in years. Perhaps because Ezenwani was not asking him to believe anything supernatural. He was simply describing a world in which actions had a weight that extended beyond the economic. "If I return the land," Emeka said, "what happens?" "Nothing magical happens," Ezenwani said. "You will not suddenly become a different man. Your past does not disappear. But you will have made a choice that aligns you with the living world instead of opposing it. And in that alignment, something can breathe again. Perhaps in you. Perhaps in the village. Perhaps in both." He paused, then added, with the gentleness of someone saying a hard thing kindly, "Your mother's prayers protected you for a long time. But she is gone now. You must do the protecting yourself." Emeka was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "All right." It was not simple, legally, to return the land. He had done everything correctly by the letter of the law, and undoing it required going back through the same processes in reverse: filings, withdrawals, compensation agreements with the government office that had processed the original acquisition. His lawyers thought he had lost his mind and said so in the polite, euphemistic language that expensive lawyers used to say direct things. He returned the land to Nwosu and the 3 other families who had refused to sell. He returned it in its entirety, with the increased value it had accrued after the road expansion, without asking for any of the original purchase price back from the families who had sold. He took the full financial loss himself, without mitigation, which amounted to a sum that would make most men ill to consider. For Emeka, it was significant but survivable. He also, and this was not legally required, no one asked him to do it, it simply arrived in his mind one morning as a necessary thing: repaired Nwosu's farmland. The construction of his retaining wall had affected the drainage of the soil in ways that made farming harder than it had been. He brought in agricultural engineers, amended the soil, restored the natural water channels. Nwosu stood and watched the work being done with his arms folded and his face arranged in an expression that Emeka could not read. It was not gratitude, exactly, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not triumph. It was something older than all 3. When the work was finished, Nwosu came to Emeka, and they stood together at the river's edge for a while without speaking. Finally, Nwosu said, "Your mother used to stand right here. Every morning, before the sun was fully up, she would stand here and talk to the river. I used to see her when I came to check my crops." He was quiet for a moment. "She never asked for things for herself. Only for you." Emeka looked at the river. The water was moving in its ancient, unhurried way, indifferent to politics, to economics, to the dramas of human ambition. It had been here before Ajogun existed, and would be hereafter. It carried things, and it gave things, and it took things, and it had no opinion about any of it, and that was perhaps the most humbling thing about it. "I know," Emeka said quietly. That night, for the first time in over a year, he did not wake at midnight. He slept all the way through to dawn, deep, dreamless, the way he had slept as a child in his mother's house, before there was anything to protect or prove or possess. The crack in his wall did not close by itself. That is not how the world works. He had it repaired properly by a mason who understood concrete and did good work. The borehole was investigated by a different set of technicians who found a blockage that the first team had missed and cleared it. The water came back. He had a small pond dug near the compound's garden and did not put expensive imported fish in it. He put river fish in it, the kind that had always lived in the Omi, the kind his mother used to buy from the fishermen when she had money and go without when she did not. They were not decorative. They were alive in the way that living things are alive when they are in the right water. And now, before the final part of this story, please, if you have not already, subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon. Press it right now, wherever you are watching from. These stories from the heart of Africa deserve to be heard. They deserve to travel. Help them find the people who need them. Subscribe. Click the bell. Let the story continue. The years that followed were not the years of Emeka's greatest wealth. He never returned to the height of fortune he had reached in his mid-40s. Some of the contracts did not return. Ifani's partnership was not reconstructed. The property values along the river, which he no longer owned, continued to rise and made other people wealthy. He watched this from a distance, and there were moments, honest, quiet moments in the middle of nights that were no longer sleepless, when he felt the sting of it, the pure economic grief of what he had walked away from. But there were other things. He started a foundation in his mother's name, Adi's Children, that paid school fees in Ajogun and 3 neighboring villages. Not as a tax strategy, not for public relations, though it became publicly known eventually and people spoke well of it. He did it because he remembered being a child who needed it and found a way to survive anyway, and he did not want survival to be so hard for other children. He hired a young woman from the village to run the foundation. A 24-year-old named Chidinma, sharp as a newly forged blade, who had been working as a seamstress because there was no other option available to her. Within 2 years, she had built the foundation's operations into something that Emeka himself could not have done, because she understood the village in ways his city years had blurred in him. He paid her well and stayed out of her way and felt, in watching her work, a satisfaction that no property deal had ever given him. He visited the river sometimes. Not with any ceremony, not with offerings or rituals. He was not his mother and did not pretend to be. He simply went to the edge and stood there, as she had stood, and thought about the things that are worth measuring and the things that are not. Old Nwosu died the winter Emeka turned 55. He died in his farmland, which the elders said was exactly how he would have wanted it. In the soil his family had tended for generations, under the sky that had watched him work and age and remain himself through all of it. His children buried him there, as he had requested, at the edge of the river, in the earth he had refused to sell. At the funeral, Nwosu's eldest son came to Emeka and shook his hand. Not warmly, not coldly. Simply, as 2 men who have been through something real together shake hands. Without performance, without the need to say more than the gesture itself said. Emeka accepted the handshake and said, "He was a better man than I was." Nwosu's son looked at him for a moment and then said simply, "He knew that." He also said, in his last weeks, that he thought you were trying. Trying. It was not absolution. It was not celebration. It was the acknowledgement that a man had looked at himself clearly, found the distance between who he was and who he ought to be, and decided to move. Not run. Not perform. Simply, honestly, persistently move. Emeka went home that evening and sat in his sitting room. Still comfortable, still furnished better than most in the village, but quieter now, emptier of the particular clutter of ego that wealth accumulates around itself when it is not watched. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly. Just water. From the tap. Cold and clear and coming from underground, from the water table that connected everything to everything. The same water that fed the river. The same river that had spoken his name in dreams. The same river his mother had addressed every morning as though it were kin. The village never gave him back the title of chief. That was not how it worked. You do not undo years of contempt and weeks of tears, and the particular grief of Nwosu weeping in his farmland simply by making a good decision eventually. The village remembered, because communities are the memory of their people, and they do not forget the way individuals sometimes are able to forget. But they did slowly, over years, the way weather changes, stop seeing him as only one thing. He became, in the village's understanding, a complicated story. A man who had fallen in a particular direction and then, at considerable cost, changed direction. The story of his fall was still told. So was the story of his turning. That is, in many ways, the most honest kind of story. Not the one where a man is simply good, or simply bad, or simply punished, or simply redeemed. But the one where a man is all of these things, one after another, with the river running through it all, patient and certain, knowing every name. Because rivers do not forget. They carry everything that has ever been put into them. The grief of old women praying at dawn, the ambition of young men who have never known hunger, the tears of farmers watching their land being taken, the slow, determined footsteps of a man walking towards something he broke and trying, with all that he has remaining to repair it. The river Omi still curves around Ajogun. The hyacinth still floats. The egrets still stand in the shallows, white as thoughts, patient as time. And sometimes, in the early morning, when the mist sits on the water and the village is only beginning to wake, people say they can still see the figure of a woman standing at the edge. Not there, exactly, not visible the way a living person is visible, but present the way memory is present. The way love is present when the person who carried it is gone, but the shape of it remains in the air, in the water, in the land. Adise, who prayed for her son to be great, and also to be good, and who knew, even in her silence, even in those last years when she stopped speaking to him about the things that mattered, that these two things are not enemies, that a man can still find his way from one to the other, that the river will wait. That is the story of Chukwemeka Obi, who was the richest man in the village, until the river spoke his name, and he finally had the courage to listen. Thank you for staying until the end. These stories live because of you, because you choose to listen, because you share them, because you believe that the old wisdom still has something to say to us in this new world. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon so you never miss another one. Every story we tell is a thread in the fabric of who we are. Keep listening, keep remembering, and we will keep telling.